Again, welcome everybody. This morning we're going to be hearing from Dana Garbarski and her team about Cook County Survey. And Dana, I'm going to let you go ahead and take it from here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you everyone at Curl for allowing us to present our work. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you all see my screen? Great. Okay. So first I want to introduce our team. So this is very much a collaborative effort. So this emerged from conversations between myself, I'm an associate professor in the sociology department, and David Doherty, who's an associate professor in political science, and us seeing a lack of research about the Cook County community more generally in terms of understanding some of the features that we see in urban environments in general, as well as in Cook County in particular, wanting to know more about that. So we also wanted to have a project that students could be part of and be able to learn some primary research from, in particular, a social science perspective. So last year, David and I kicked off this study. We got some pilot funding from the Office of Research Services, so we were really grateful for that, and that helped to support the first wave of our survey. So last year we have, as the faculty mentors, myself and David, we had 2 graduate students from the sociology department, and you'll be hearing from them today. And we had several undergraduate students from both sociology and political science. Now, some of those students have graduated, and we have some new students that have joined our team as well, but we also have a lot of the same people working with us this year. So it's so far been a really fun collaborative project that we've been working on. So what are the goals? The goals were, we want to eventually be able to establish a repeated cross-sectional survey of residents of Cook County, Illinois. We think that it's a distinctive political and set of social issues facing urban environments in the United States, as well as issues that are relevant to Cook County in particular. We want to know both the enduring issues that happen as well as some of the more emerging ones, right? We see surveys as a way of finding out emerging issues before maybe we hear more about them in the news cycle, for example. And again, we also had that pedagogical motivation, wanting to give students this unique experiential learning opportunity. So the process we follow is very inductive, iterative, and systematic, where we started our project in the fall last year, asking students what are the kinds of things they're interested in, and also what are things that it would be useful to know with respect to how Cook County residents feel about certain issues. So we asked them in general, what are some of the topics you're interested in? Those start to be our constructs of interest. We look at previous academic research as well as research reports. We look at things going on in the news. We also look at public opinion research and surveys to see how some of those topics have been asked. And so we kind of go through this process multiple times where we think about what do we want to know? We write our research questions. We look at previous research. We look at how it's being done in surveys, and we continue on. And the idea is, for social scientists are well familiar with this idea of moving from conceptualization of our broader abstract questions of interest to operationalization. And so how are we going to actually measure it? That's where our survey questions develop from. So we go through these processes simultaneously. And then, because students are either working by themselves or working in teams with respect to the topics that they're interested in, we then have to go through this integrative process of putting it all together, where we have each student or set of students research questions, and then we have to put it together. We have to decide what order do we want to put the topics in within our survey, how do we want to order the questions within the different sections, and rewriting the questions to make them fit the best practices for survey research. So our wave 1 topics, we had a wide variety of ideas. We asked questions about neighborhoods and gentrification, environmental conditions where people live, politics and political participation. This was just after the 2020 presidential election. Questions about political efficacy, a variety of questions about policing, and then of course we wanted to ask some questions about COVID-19. The sample, where does our sample come from? So we used a research platform called Dynata. It's a data platform with a large and diverse panel of respondents. This is not a probability-based sampling design. but it is a design that allowed us to try to get a descriptively representative sample of Cook County residents. So meaning that the sample could be matched to the sociodemographic features of Cook County with respect to gender, age, ethno-racial self-identification, and so forth. And so we were pretty good at having our sample of respondents become descriptively representative of Cook County across a variety of sociodemographic characteristics. But there were a couple places where we definitely are underrepresenting certain folks in the population. And in particular, underrepresenting the Latina or Latinx population in Cook County, so by about 10 percentage points. Whereas we're also underrepresenting the Asian and Black populations in Cook County, but that's closer to maybe 3 to 5 percentage points underrepresented compared to census estimates. So this does have implications for if we were just going to present, our descriptive statistics of our questions of interest, but we often are interested in reporting how respondents feel about these things across racial ethnic groups. So it does allow it's not as much of an issue, although we do have weights if we wanted to weight our descriptive statistics. It allows us because we have such a large sample, we are able to make some relevant subgroup comparisons. Although we have very small sample sizes for some of our ethno-racial groups, such that any results that we present today, we say are suggestive for particularly the Asian population, those who identify as another ethno-racial group or more than one race ethnicity. So here's again the characteristics. So just to show you what I mean about the overrepresentation. So in our sample, almost 60% of the respondents identify as white, and in Cook County more generally, that's about 42%. So the white population is very much overrepresented in the sample, and we are underrepresenting the Latina, Latinx population in particular, slightly underrepresenting the Black population and Asian populations of Cook County. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it off to our first student presenter to present the section that they worked on and some of the results from their study.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and today I'll be walking you through some of the analysis we have done on the gentrification block of the survey. Next slide, Dana, please. So I want to quickly define gentrification before we start looking at the data. And gentrification is generally understood as the process of how an influx of wealthier residents can change the environment of an underdeveloped neighborhood. And just as an example of this process, it can be seen here in the Chicago neighborhood of Pilsen. Next slide, Dana, please. So our survey in this section responded 6 questions, and we gathered information on how long respondents have lived in their neighborhood, their sense of belonging to that neighborhood, their sense of where their neighborhood is headed, their sense of their cost of housing, their sense of their safety at night, their sense of how accepting their neighborhood is of immigrants, and their sense of how similar they are to their neighbors in terms of racial or ethnic identification. Next slide, please. But today we'll just be focusing on 2 of the questions, their sense of how costs of housing have changed and their sense of where their neighborhood is headed. We focus on these questions because often a telltale sign of gentrification is an increase in the cost of housing. And we wanted to measure perceptions on if potentially respondents felt that gentrification could make their neighborhood change into the right direction, the wrong direction, or no change. Next slide, please, Dana. Thank you. So here I'm displaying a cross tabulation of the responses we received to those 2 questions from every respondent. And among respondents who answered that their neighborhood is staying the same, about 70% answered that they saw no change in their cost of housing. And then among respondents who said their neighborhood is staying the same, about 50% answered their costs of housing have increased. But this doesn't tell us much, so we're going to break it down by self-identified racial or ethnic identity. Here I'm showing a crosstab of the answers to the 2 questions from respondents who self-identified as Black. And like the previous table, we can see that among respondents who answered that their neighborhood is staying the same, over 60% also answered that they saw no change in their cost of housing. And again, similar to the previous table, we see that among respondents who answered that their neighborhood is staying the same, over 40% answered that they saw an increase in their cost of housing. But interestingly, among respondents who saw their neighborhood is getting better, over 40% saw a decrease in their cost of housing. Next slide, Dana, please. So here is a crosstab for responses among respondents who self-identified as Hispanic. And like the previous two tables I've shown, among respondents who say their neighborhood is staying the same, many, about over 75%, saw no change in the cost of their housing. And then among self-identified Hispanic respondents who answered that their neighborhood is getting worse, over 45% saw a decrease in their cost of housing. Next slide, please. So like the previous tables, among white respondents who answered that their neighborhood is staying the same, over 70% saw no change in their cost of housing. And then among self-identified white respondents who answered their neighborhood is getting better, very few, about less than 10%, saw their cost of housing decrease. Next slide, please. So overall, in all categories, most respondents saw little change in their cost of housing and that the direction of their neighborhood is headed in. So do higher costs of housing mean a better neighborhood? Most respondents who did see their costs increase saw their neighborhood stay the same, although among self-identified Hispanic respondents who saw their costs decrease, over 45% answered that their neighborhood is moving in a worse direction. But among self-identified Black respondents who saw their costs decrease, about 40% said their neighborhood is moving in a better direction. So what do these findings tell us about perceptions of gentrification? Gentrification may not only be tied to the cost of housing and neighborhood quality measures, or perhaps residents are more ambivalent about gentrification or do not notice changes in their neighborhood. So what do we do next? I think it's important for us to look for more causal mechanisms for what affects the summary judgment of the neighborhood captured by that direction of the neighborhood question, and then to analyze the accuracy of people's perceptions in comparison to objective data. And we may also collect more data on subjective perceptions that could be linked to patterns of gentrification, and then we can share our findings in the scholarly work. Thank you, Dana.
Thank you, Sarah. Now, my name is Juanita Vivas Bastidas, and I'm going to be running through the environment blog, some of the questions that we had, and some.
Juanita, we're not able to hear you, or at least I'm not. Maybe it's just my sound, or not hear you well.
Let me see. Does this work? Does this work better?
Perfect. Thank you.
I was ready for it. Okay. So next slide, please. Thank you, Dana. So I was tasked to formulate 3 questions that would take advantage of the diversity of Cook County while at the same time offer relevant findings to community stakeholders such as environmental justice activists and in general the environmental scholarship. And together with Dr. Maria Shurin, sociology professor and environmental sociologist, we reflected on the particular contribution that we wanted to make and decided to approach this opportunity through an environmental racism framework. Environmental racism contends that there is a disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. And as such, we focus on exploring how different ethnoracial groups in our sample perceive the risk in their built environments, how they identified changes that would improve their neighborhood's environment, how they prioritized a set of considerations given a hypothetical scenario, and also how they participated in environmental activism. And so the 3 questions that we developed were: first, how concerned are Cook County residents about the environmental conditions of their neighborhoods, and how do such concerns vary across individuals and neighborhoods? We also asked, and in this case, we followed the Environmental Protection Agency divisions and focused on air, water, and soil. We also asked, how do Cook County residents prioritize different considerations when evaluating the development of new industrial facilities? And finally, how do patterns of involvement in environmental action vary across Cook County residents and neighborhoods? Next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of the way in which we operationalize these concepts that we were interested in exploring for research question number 1, again, dealing with concerns about the environmental conditions of one's neighborhood, we look at levels of perceived risk of environmental harm through a measurement of comfort. As such, we ask respondents, thinking in general about the quality of air, how comfortable do you feel breathing the air in your neighborhood? Not at all comfortable, a little comfortable, somewhat comfortable, or very comfortable. And for this question in particular, we ask respondents to exclude considerations relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. We also asked, thinking in general about the quality of water from your tap, how comfortable do you feel drinking your tap water without a filter? And third, thinking in general about the quality of soil, how comfortable do you feel eating food grown in your neighborhood soil? Next slide, please. Thank you. And so this first graph shows us how the different ethnoracial groups in our sample responded to the question about perceived risk breathing the air in one's neighborhood, measured again through level of comfort. In the first place, after conducting the appropriate statistical test, we were able to conclude that there is in fact a relationship with our measurement of level of comfort breathing the air in one's neighborhood and ethnoracial self-identification. Descriptively, looking at the blue and gray bars, we see that respondents who self-identify as Black alone and Hispanic or Latina from any race are more likely to respond that they either do not feel comfortable at all or only feel a little comfortable breathing the air in their neighborhood. Looking at the maroon bar, we see that respondents who self-identify as white are more likely to report that they feel very comfortable breathing the air in their neighborhood. Next slide, please. Now, this second graph shows how the different ethnoracial groups in our sample again responded to the question about perceived risk drinking tap water without a filter, again measured as level of comfort. After conducting the appropriate statistical test, we were able to conclude that there is in fact a relationship between our measurement of level of comfort drinking tap water without a filter and ethnoracial self-identification. Descriptively, looking at the blue and gray bars, we see again that respondents who self-identify as Black alone and Hispanic or Latina from any race are more likely to report not feeling comfortable at all or only a little bit comfortable drinking tap water without a filter. Looking at the maroon bars, we see that respondents who self-identify as white are more likely to report feeling very comfortable drinking tap water without a filter in their neighborhood. Next slide, please. And finally, this third graph shows how the different ethnoracial groups in our sample responded to the question about perceived risk eating food grown in their neighborhood soil, again measured through levels of comfort. And after conducting the appropriate statistical test, again, we were able to confirm that there is in fact a relationship between our measurement of level of comfort eating food grown in one's neighborhood soil and ethnoracial self-identification. Descriptively, again, looking at the blue and gray bars, we see that respondents who self-identify as Black alone and Hispanic or Latina from any race are more likely to report not feeling comfortable at all, especially those who self-identify as Black, or only feeling a little bit comfortable eating food grown in their neighborhood soil. Looking at the maroon bars, we see that respondents who self-identify as white alone are more likely to report feeling very comfortable eating food grown in their neighborhood soil. Thank you. Next slide. Now for this question, number one, we also wanted to ask respondents to rank the top 3 suggestions of what they thought would improve the environment in their neighborhoods the most. And we gave them 7 options to choose from. We had access to green spaces, efforts to address flooding, less pollution from trash, including plastic waste, less pollution from construction sites and industrial facilities, safer drinking water, less traffic, and improved options for public transit. Next slide. Thank you. And here I'm only going to mention what we perceived as the most relevant findings, again, following the APA divisions, air, water, and soil. For this section, the legend means yellow for no, not included in the top 3, and maroon for yes, included in the top 3. And so thinking about which ethnoracial groups in our sample included less pollution from trash, including plastic waste, in their top 3, we see that across ethnoracial groups, everyone reported feeling that less pollution from trash, including plastic waste, would improve their neighborhoods. Next slide, please. Looking at which ethnoracial groups in our sample included less pollution from construction sites and industrial facilities in their top 3, we see that respondents who self-identify as Hispanic or Latina from any race were particularly more likely to report this suggestion as one that would improve the conditions of their environment in their neighborhoods. Next slide, please. Finally, looking at which ethnoracial groups in our sample included less traffic in their top 3, we see that respondents who self-identify as white alone were more likely to identify less traffic or fewer cars as a suggestion that would improve their environment. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of water, thinking about which ethnoracial group in our sample included safer drinking water in their top 3, we see that respondents who self-identify as Black alone were particularly more likely to report that safer drinking water would improve the conditions in their neighborhood. Next slide, please. And finally, thinking about which ethnoracial groups in our sample included access to green spaces in their top 3, we see that respondents who self-identify as Black alone and Hispanic or Latina from any race are more likely to report that access to green space would improve the conditions in their neighborhood. Next slide, please. For research question number 2, again, dealing with how Cook County residents prioritize different considerations when evaluating the development of new district industrial facilities, we asked respondents to rank the top 3 most important considerations for the development of a new facility. The options that we offered were 1, creation of local jobs, growth of the local economy, pollution of the local environment, impact on local public health, negative effects on local property values, presence of adequate local environments and protections and regulations, and implications for global climate change. And given that the main inspiration for this question was the long debate over environmental health versus economic development, we developed an index to interpret this question. And the index categorizes respondents who rank options, creation of local jobs and growth of the local economy in their top 3 as being more economically focused, respondents who ranked options pollution of the local environment and implications for global climate change as being more environmentally focused, and those respondents who rank a combination of these considerations, for instance, both the creation of local jobs and the pollution of the local environment in their top 3 as equally environmentally and economically focused. Next slide, please. After conducting the relevant statistical test, we were able again to conclude that there is in fact a relationship between our environmental and economic index and ethnoracial self-identification. Descriptively, looking across the bar, we see that respondents who self-identify as white, Black alone, and Hispanic or Latino from any race all tend to prioritize economic considerations more than environmental ones. Looking at the blue bars, we see that respondents who self-identify as Black alone are more likely to be more economically focused when evaluating the development of new industrial facilities. And looking at the maroon bars, we see that those who self-identify as white are more likely to be more environmentally focused when evaluating the development of new industrial facilities. And so this was a question that we had, like, why are we seeing this result? So we started looking at other variables included in our survey, and we started thinking about socioeconomic status. And the proxies that we had for socioeconomic status were employment and education. And so we know that there was a higher percentage of those who self-identify as white alone reporting being employed full-time, whereas there was a higher percentage of those who self-identify as Black alone and Hispanic or Latino from any race reporting not being employed. Moreover, we also know that from those who self-identify as white alone, there was a higher percentage of people holding a BA degree or more, and those who self-identify as Black alone and Hispanic or Latino from any race reporting to having high school or less or some degree different. So we are not in a position to give a causal argument on how we are interpreting this response yet, but we do think that these variables as proxies for socioeconomic status help us contextualize what we're seeing in this result. Next slide. Finally, when we were thinking about research question number 3, which dealt again with how the patterns of involvement in environmental action vary across Cook County residents and neighborhoods, we asked, in the last 5 years, which of the following have you done? Have you attended a public meeting about an environmental issue? Have you taken a part in a protest about an environmental issue? Have you done both of these or neither of these? And for analytical purposes, we transformed this variable into a dichotomy showing either no participation or participation. Next slide, please. After conducting the appropriate statistical test, we were able again to conclude that there is in fact a relationship between our measurement of environmental activism and ethnoracial self-identification. Descriptively, looking at the maroon bars, we see that respondents who self-identify as Black alone and Hispanic or Latino from any race are more likely to participate in environmental activism. Next slide, please. Thank you. So all things considered, our findings are really consistent with literature on environmental racism. The data considered here suggests that Cook County residents who self-identify as Black alone and Hispanic or Latino from any race are more likely to perceive a higher risk of environmental harm in their neighborhoods and are also more likely to participate in environmental activism. In terms of our next steps, together with Dr. Marek Shurin, Dr. Dana Garbarski, and Dr. Dave Doherty, we are exploring what predicts environmental activism in our sample using logistic regression. And we plan to share our findings with environmental justice activists in the form of a report, but also with scholars as a peer review article in an environmental sociology journal. Thank you so much. I'm gonna pass it to Dana, who's gonna speak about political participation. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Great. So Sophia helped to write our section on political participation and political efficacy, and she is studying abroad in Italy right now. So I'm going to just do a smattering of her results for her. So she was very interested in people's experiences with how voting went during the 2020 presidential election. In particular, what is it like to vote during a global pandemic? And so asking people whether they voted or not, and if they voted, a series of questions about their experiences, and if they did not vote, why they were not able to vote. Were they not interested? Were they not registered? Was it because of COVID-19, for example? If they did vote, she was interested in, did people experience harassment? Were they asked to show an ID? Did they experience any poll watchers? Was their voting location changed from the last time they tried to vote? So she's just started looking at the data. She's going to dig in more when she comes back and does her sociology senior capstone. But one of the things she was interested in was whether people were asked for an ID when they voted, and in particular seeing that the younger age groups were more likely to have been asked for an ID when they voted than the older age groups. And among those who didn't vote, looking at the age distribution of people saying they didn't vote because of COVID. So again, remembering that November 2020 was prior to access to vaccines, higher proportion of those ages 45-64 saying that they didn't vote because of COVID compared to the younger age groups. She also looked in general who voted versus didn't vote in the 2020 election, and looked at across ethno-racial identity as well as gender, and was interested in the fact that 91% of the respondents who identify as white in our sample voted, compared to lesser political participation with respect to voting across these ethno-racial groups. And then in particular, she was very interested in those who did not identify as part of the gender binary being less likely to vote in the 2020 election. Now, that was 9 sample members in our particular sample. So we don't want to make any sort of claims about that here statistically, but she thought that that would be really interesting to be able to explore in future research with a data set that would have a higher number of respondents who do not identify as a woman or a man. And so she's very interested in maybe doing, using the descriptive statistics we have from this study to say something, doing some qualitative research about people's voting experiences. She's interested in particular, looking at those who are outside the gender binary. They also, those who ended up saying that they did vote. So not only were they less likely to vote, but those who did vote were more likely to experience harassment. Now, again, out of 9 people, total. So she's very interested in exploring, is that a trend that we see more broadly in the study? So it actually was more of hypothesis generating with respect to the results that she found. So I'm very curious to see what she chooses exploring for her capstone when she comes back in the spring. Importantly, she's going to put together a report of people's voting experiences, who voted, who didn't, why, how their experience was when they voted, why they didn't vote, and share it with community organizers as well as the Cook County Clerk's Office. So with suggestions for voter outreach and addressing some of these issues. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it back to Juanita, who's going to present a few of the questions that we asked about political efficacy that she and Sophia worked together to develop.
Thank you. So with respect to political efficacy, both Sophia and I were really interested in exploring public opinion regarding internal and external political efficacy. And so internal political efficacy stands for the belief that one can understand politics and therefore participate in politics. External political efficacy, in contrast, stands for the belief that the government will respond to one's demands. Next slide, please. Accordingly, we ask respondents, first, how much would you say you know about the political issues facing your city or town? And second, how responsive are local officials to the needs of people who look like you? Next slide, please. And so this first graph shows how the different ethno-racial groups in our sample responded to our question about internal political efficacy. And after conducting the appropriate statistical test, we again were able to conclude that there is a relationship between internal political efficacy, or our measurement of internal political efficacy, and ethno-racial self-identification. Descriptively, if we look at the blue bars, we see that respondents who self-identify as Hispanic or Latina from any race are more likely to report feeling like they know nothing about the political issues facing their city or town. Looking at the maroon bars, we see that respondents who self-identify as white alone and Black alone are more likely to report feeling like they know a lot about the political issues facing their city or town. Next slide, please. In this second graph, we are looking at how the different ethno-racial groups in our sample responded to their question about external political efficacy. And after conducting the appropriate statistical test, again, we were able to conclude that there is in fact a relationship between our measurement of external political efficacy and ethno-racial self-identification. Descriptively, if we look across the graph, it looks like respondents who self-identify as white alone, Black alone, and Hispanic or Latina from any race all report feeling like local public officials are somewhat responsive to the needs of people that look like them. Particularly looking at the blue bars, we see that respondents who self-identify as Black alone and Hispanic or Latina from any race are more likely to report feeling like local public officials are not at all responsive to people who look like them. Thank you. And I'm gonna now pass it to Keyla, who's gonna be speaking about policing.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. All right, great. So I'm Keyla. I am a student in the sociology department. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about policing, policies, and attitudes. These questions are kind of built off of the resurgence that we've seen. So we conducted this survey, or we put it together fall of 2020. So after kind of like that resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, police that push for police reform. So it's kind of like where these questions come from, just so you can get like in the mindset. Next slide, please. So these are a couple of research questions that we had when kind of putting together the section on policing. How does the public perceive police treatment of Black, Indigenous, and people of color residents? And do opinions over body cameras vary between suburban Cook County and Chicago residents? We know that there's a couple of different approaches to body cameras in the suburbs versus Chicago. So that was a question that we were interested in, and then we're particularly interested in how the questions we ask intersect with race or ethnicity. And there are a spread of questions, so I'm only going to present a couple today where we conducted tests of associations. So next slide, please. So the first question I'm going to show you is this question on excessive force. How much do you support or oppose a proposal to prosecute police officers who use excessive force? Response options being strongly support, somewhat support, neither support nor oppose, somewhat oppose, strongly opposed. Next slide, please. So here with a test of association, we find that there is a relationship between support for prosecution for excessive force and ethnoracial self-identification. Descriptively, about 50% of respondents support a measure that prosecutes police officers for excessive use of force. And when you look a little bit closer, respondents who identify as Black, more than one racial ethnic group, or another racial ethnic group are more likely to support prosecution of police for use of excessive force. Next slide, please. The second survey question I'm going to present is the one on body-worn cameras. So police use of body-worn cameras varies across municipalities. When do you think police should use body-worn cameras? 1, never. 2, some of the time, for example, when investigating criminal activity, but not when interviewing witnesses. 3, all of the time with minimal exceptions, for example, when requested by the victim of a crime. And 4, all the time with no exceptions. And I know this question carries certain implications because obviously this is a public opinion question, and it may be a little bit different when it comes to laws and regulations as to when police officers can actually have their body camera on and off. So I think these results are particularly interesting. Next slide, please. Again, with the test of association, we find that there is a relationship between support for body-worn cameras and ethno-racial self-identification. About 60% of all respondents believe body-worn cameras should be used all the time with no exceptions. About 71% of respondents that identify as Black support body-worn cameras on all the time with no exceptions. And this is followed closely by those that identify as some other race or more than one race. And this is kind of the same trend we saw in the last question, the last results, that there is this kind of trend where these respondents that identify as more than one or some other race kind of have these significant results. About 60% of respondents in the sample support legislation that requires officers to have body-worn cameras on all the time with no exceptions. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we have 4 questions. 2 of them are asking the same question and then are separating it by the city of Chicago and suburb, and the last 2 are asking the same question with the same format. We adopted these questions from Pew. They conducted a study, 2017, I believe, where they asked these questions and we kind of just altered them slightly for our survey. So the first question, how would you rate the job police officers in the city of Chicago are doing when it comes to using the right amount of force for each situation? The second one is the same, but for suburbs. And then the third question, how would you rate the job police officers in the city of Chicago are doing when it comes to treating people fairly, regardless of race or ethnicity? The last one is the same, but in the suburbs, and then the response options are very good, good, poor, very poor. Next slide, please. So these are the results for that first question. And it's by race again. So with the test of association, here we find that there is a relationship between opinions over the right amount of force and ethno-racial self-identification at the city level. If you take a closer look at the yellow and turquoise bars, about 47% of respondents believe police in the city do a very poor or poor job at using the right amount of force. Looking a little bit closer, respondents that identify as Black, more than one race, or Hispanic or Latino are more likely to respond that police in the city are doing a poor or very poor job at using the right amount of force in the city, regardless of race or ethnicity. So yeah, this is in the city. The next slide is on suburbs. So here we see results for the same question, but in the suburb. It's important to note that these questions are not separated, not here, by whether or not you live in the suburb or the city of Chicago. These are just general questions that are asked to every respondent. You are not categorized by according to whether, like, where it's not geocoded by where you live. Here, we also find a relationship between support for prosecution for right amount of force and ethno-racial self-identification at the suburban level. Again, looking at the yellow and turquoise bars, about 46% of respondents believe police in the suburbs do a very poor job at using the right amount of force. Looking a little bit closer at the racial groups, respondents that identify as Black are more likely to respond that police in the suburbs are doing a poor or very poor job using the right amount of force, regardless of race or ethnicity, at about 48%. Next slide, please. So here we move to the last 2 questions, and it moves to treat that question of treating people fairly regardless of race or ethnicity. So I kind of call this a racial bias, whereas the last 2 questions were more about almost job performance. So here we find a relationship again between opinions over treating people fairly regardless of race or ethnicity and ethno-racial self-identification at the city level. Descriptively, about 47% of respondents believe police in the city do a very poor or poor job at treating people fairly. Looking closer at the racial groups, respondents that identify as Black, Hispanic, or some other race are more likely to respond that police in the city are doing a poor or very poor job at treating people fairly regardless of race or ethnicity. Next slide, please. So here is the same question, but asking in terms of suburbs. So again, we find a relationship between support for prosecution for right amount of force and ethno-racial self-identification at the suburban level. Descriptively, About 46% of respondents believe police in the suburbs do a very poor job at treating people fairly. And looking at the different racial groups, respondents that identify as Black or Hispanic are more likely to respond that police in the suburbs are doing a poor or very poor job treating people fairly, regardless of race or ethnicity. Next slide, please. So just to sum up everything and to kind of give some insight into what comes next, we see results that show support for police reform. About half of respondents strongly support a measure that would prosecute police officers that engage in excessive use of force. The majority of respondents, about 3/4, support a measure that required police officers to have their body-worn cameras on all the time with no exceptions. And close to half of the respondents agree that police officers do a very poor job at treating people fairly, regardless of race or ethnicity. For the next round of the survey, we're updating a few questions, we're removing a few questions, we're kind of scrapping questions that were more legislative, because we've already seen a lot of this legislation in action in the recent House Bill 3653 that just passed. So we're going to scrap a couple of questions that asked about licensing, body cameras, excessive force complaints, things like that, because we kind of already seen that in action. So we're hoping to kind of shift the focus on the movement that is known as defund the police. We want to ask a few knowledge-based questions, as well as a few experimental questions. What I mean by that is when you look at like the health field and you talk about healthcare versus Obamacare, you get vastly different results. So the same thing here, kind of asking questions on what this even means and kind of experimenting with how you present these questions. We have a report that's going out to different agencies. We are sending this more descriptive and univariate results to the Attorney General's office. We have a few Congress people, local aldermen, and nonprofits that are interested in our report. And then additionally, we've conducted even more inferential analysis for an academic article that we are hoping to get out soon as well. And I think that's all I have. Drew is gonna talk to you more about the following policing questions that we have. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Kayla. Yeah, so the next part of the survey is also on policing, but it's looking at the policing's role in society. Next slide. So another aspect of like the discourse around policing, both on the national level and on the local level, has been surrounding the role of police in society. So this discussion has led us to looking into a way to specifically measure what Cook County residents believe the role of police in their community should be. So the way we decided to do this was we gave respondents 7 scenarios and then asked them whether they believe the police should be called to the scene in each of those scenarios with a yes/no response options. Next slide. So this is a crosstab of the data of the percentage of respondents that believe that answer that they believe the police should be called to the scene, crosstabbed with ethno-racial self-identification. So the first thing I'm going to point you to is just looking at the total column. And that, so it's the scenario with the most support for calling the police is robbery, which kind of makes sense as a classic scenario where the police are often called. The scenarios involving intimate partner disputes and schools needing help ensuring the safety of their students both also enjoy strong over 80% support among all respondents. In the following 4 scenarios, including medical emergencies, loitering, mental health crises, and expired license plates, the support is much more mixed, with a significant portion, as much as 65%, as low as 44%, supporting calling the police in each of these scenarios, but with ranging between 35 and 55% not supporting calling the police in these scenarios. So in these scenarios, these are places where we might want to take a further look into alternative options and offering respondents an option of other public safety options as opposed to just the police. The next key part of this table is the crosstabs by ethnoracial self-identification. One of the key dynamics in terms of discussions of policing is the difference between responses between respondents who self-identify as white and respondents who self-identify as Black. So here it's key that in the first two scenarios in terms of robbery and intimate partner disputes, there's virtually no difference between the responses of respondents who self-identify as white and self-identify as Black. This is also true for medical emergencies. Then when it comes to schools needing help with safety and experiencing mental health crisis, there is some support for the conclusion that those who self-identify as Black are less supportive of calling the police in these scenarios, but it's not statistically significant at the 95% confidence level. The two scenarios where there is a very significant gap between the responses of those who self-identify as white and those who self-identify as Black are loitering and expired license plates. In these scenarios, white respondents for loitering believe that 67% of white respondents believe police should be called to a scenario involving loitering, while only 52% of Black respondents. When it comes to license plates, it's 46% of white respondents compared to only 36% of those who self-identify as Black are responding. So looking forward, this could be a key thing, that the differences between white respondents supporting calling the police and Black respondents not supporting that as much, that it's not really in all scenarios, it's really limited to specific scenarios, specifically loitering and scenarios involving expired license plates. Another key statistically significant finding was that those who self-identify as Hispanic are significantly more likely to support calling the police in scenarios of medical emergency. This is not something that we have as much previous data and previous support for this conclusion. So this could potentially be a place where we look further into to see if there's a reason for this or if it's more of a statistical anomaly. Next slide. So the next key dynamic that we wanted to take a look at was the same questions, the same scenarios, but looking at by political identification. This is also an issue that's become a major political issue, with the common belief that Democrats are very supportive of alternative policing options, while the Republicans are more supportive of calling the police. Here, it's very key that in the top three scenarios with the most support, including robbery, intimate partner disputes, and schools, there's virtually no difference between the respondents who identify as Republicans and the respondents who identify as Democrats. All three, the support is over 80% for both Republicans and Democrats. However, in the following four, including medical emergencies, loitering, mental health crises, and expired license plates, a significant gap emerges between Republican respondents and those who identify as respondents who identify as Democrats, ranging between 10 and 24-point spreads. This is, again, a key aspect where that the political nature of this discussion, it isn't really about calling the police in any scenario. What this data would indicate, that at least in Cook County, that the divides between Republicans and Democrats in Cook County really come down to these scenarios involving medical emergencies, loitering, mental health, expired license plates, and therefore it would make sense to center the discussion around the police versus alternative options more in terms of these type of scenarios, as opposed to scenarios where, like robberies, intimate partner disputes, and schools, where members of both parties very significantly support calling the police. Next slide. So summarizing some of these findings in general, the vast majority of residents agree that the police should be called in scenarios involving robberies, intimate partner disputes, and school safety. So that means that in those scenarios, there's high level of support for the police, and that is the preferred response. However, significant differences in response patterns arise between self-identified racial groups about whether the police should be called into scenarios involving medical emergencies, loitering, and expired license plates. This means that these could be places where we want to do further research and also further outreach into communities about what the best solutions to those scenarios are, and if it involves the police or if it involves alternative options to the police in terms of a Department of Public Safety. When it comes to Republicans are much more likely to favor calling police in scenarios involving medical emergencies, mental health crises, loitering, and expired license plates than Democrats or independents. So that, again, the politicized nature really coming down to scenarios like that, as opposed to scenarios like robberies or school safety. And then next steps, we plan to have this data included in the report that Keyla previously mentioned, distributed to public officials. And then plans for further research include looking into public opinion on alternatives to police, so actually offering respondents an alternative and juxtaposing that with the option of police. And then also with questions on new or different training for police officers to see if that would change people's opinions on if the police are a viable option in those scenarios. Next slide. Okay. I think this is Dave at this point.
Thank you everyone for joining us. So to wrap up, as Dana noted at the outset, this is a project that kind of grew out of our interest in both pursuing research that can shed light on public opinion sort of in our more local community, and also out of a desire to find avenues for getting students involved in the research process from sort of start to finish. So the survey that we ended up fielding can serve as an avenue for gathering data on public attitudes about issues, and specifically focusing on issues that might be important to the local community that might not be asked about in national surveys. By adopting this sort of micro level focus, we're able to offer insights into the attitudes of people in the local community again, and these attitudes are likely to be of particular interest to stakeholders who are doing work in the local community, whether they be policymakers in cities and villages in Cook County, advocacy groups working to change policies, or others. The potential for scholarly contributions is also here, though it's not been our sort of top priority with these projects. A real attraction of this project is that it really does provide an opportunity for students to participate in the research project really from start to finish, from identifying a topic or an area that's interesting to them, through thinking through how to go about measuring concepts that are related to that topic, and then down the line, doing things like testing and building surveys and analyzing the data that results. Finally, I'll note that this project is closely related to some of the university's expressed sort of core values. Many of the issues that students choose to work on have very obvious implications for the pursuit of social justice, whether that be in the domain of environmental policy, how housing policy is structured, or how policing practices are pursued in the city and the surrounding area. Next slide, please. Final slide, please. So what's next? Our hope is to establish this as an ongoing annual project. So we are in the process of seeking funds to support this going forward. We will be submitting a grant proposal to the NSF and are also putting out feelers for alum, other internal sources of funds, and other ways that we could continue supporting this project. Ideally, we would like to gather enough funding to move beyond our reliance on descriptively representative, mostly descriptively representative, but still kind of convenient sample data source, to a situation where we could afford a more sophisticated and ideally more representative sample of the Cook County population. Finally, going forward, we're going to be pursuing more in-depth and robust engagement with community stakeholders. This was part of the original plan, and like so much else, the pandemic got in the way. Through this iteration, we're having the opportunity to do more to encourage students to go out and reach out to local advocacy groups and other stakeholders, We have some students who are, for example, interning with aldermen in the city, who were able to sort of help kind of foster deeper connections in those circumstances that will hopefully allow us to not only be conducting research that's more relevant to the local community, but will also perhaps do things like open doors for students who want to pursue work in those local institutions. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. This has been very interesting. So let's go ahead and open it up for questions and comments. Feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question, or if you're more comfortable in the chat, we can also do that.
Well, this is Chris George, and I think that this was really wonderful. I mean, the scope of it and what you've been able to do. I just have a couple of questions and suggestions. One is, I noted, and I missed the first few minutes of this, so it could be there's a methodological and sample size issue, but you really didn't talk about Asians. And I saw in stuff going by, there were some interesting things. And I think if you're talking about people of color and you're talking about differences, I really think that that should be included in the analysis.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. The reason we didn't at this point is because the sample size is so small that we think the results might be suggestive of an area for future research, but we don't have the statistical confidence to draw group distinctions in the same way we do with some of the other groups. So that's why we focused on the groups that we have a larger sample size.
Yeah, I thought that might be the reason. I just, doing other research that I'm currently doing on another subject on racial disparities, I know that the Asian community is just really hungry for any data, even hints of data. And so I think that some concentration on that might still be worthwhile as a presentation and sort of thing. The other question I had is, did you have any economic data? Did you ask people about income at all? Because I'm wondering, I think it would be very interesting among where you have the larger samples to see if there's disparities, or do you have stuff about people who have a college degree and don't have a college degree? Because I think there might be some within issues that would be very interesting to, I mean, that I would personally be interested in, but I think other people would be interested in as well. And then the only other thing I had to do in terms of the voting, did you ask people if they voted by mail? Because so when you ask questions about did you experience harassment and stuff like that, it was you only looked at the people who said that they voted in person, right? Okay, I just wasn't clear about that.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Yes, indeed. The skip pattern processing was, did you vote? And if you said yes, we asked how you voted. And indeed, if you were in person, we asked the questions about the experience. Yeah. Thank you for asking and allowing me to clarify that.
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting, I'm just saying, about seeing if there was a racial or ethnic disparity in terms of the people who voted in person. Yep. as opposed to, I mean, I think that that's a sort of an important issue in terms of voting rights. So
I agree. I'll definitely share that with Sophia. I hope she sort of deals with that when she starts working on her capstone, sort of looking at the different sociodemographics.
Yeah. And I would say in the future research in terms of in terms of police issues and people saying, well, now there's legislation passed, which is dealing with body cams and other things like that. The implementation process being what it is, I still think it might be interesting to ask people, A, do they know that the legislation passed? Mm-hmm. And secondly, have they seen that it's been implemented in their area? I mean, I'm just saying that I think that those things would still be very valuable.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I also wanted to talk about income. We didn't ask income per se, but we did ask people about their level of education, their employment status, and we did create a question asking about somewhat of financial insecurity. So in the past 6 months, have any of the following things happened to you or someone in your household? And it's yes, no, and falling behind on paying rent or mortgage, had problems paying for food, fallen behind on credit cards or other bills, and had problems affording healthcare costs or prescriptions. So we have that as sort of a unique way to get at financial insecurity.
Yeah, I think that would be fascinating to look at, and also in terms of education level, since we know that that seems to have a really impact on political beliefs right now.
Right.
You know, so.
Thank you, Christine.
I can speak a little bit about the particular findings that we have in terms of education and also employment. And so as I was mentioning, in terms of education, looking at our sample distribution, we know that there was a higher percentage of those who self-identify as white alone reporting being employed full-time, whereas a higher percentage of those who self-identify as Black alone or Hispanic or Latina from any race reported not being employed. And in terms of education, we also know that there was a higher percentage of those who self-identify as white alone reporting holding a BA or more. And in contrast, a higher percentage of those who self-identify as Black alone and Hispanic or Latina from any race reporting either having a high school degree or less, or some college or associate degree.
And I see that, Christian, you have your hand up if you want to go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to congratulate you all. I mean, this project is fascinating. I think it satisfies, numerous objectives, but most importantly, to engage social science students with real data. No, and I think that's very important for us in the Loyola community, because we all can take advantage of this in many ways. I have two questions. My first question is regarding the Latino sample size. I know that that is one of the limitations of the data, but I just wanted to verify: is it a 14% Latino, 83% foreign born? So overall, we are. My main concern with the analysis was that you were talking about Latinos or Latinx, Hispanic, but we only have about
83% born in the US.
83% born in the US. So then I thought that they were the foreign born. So right. Yeah, that was my concern, because okay, how can we talk about Latinos? Especially considering all the Latino diversity compared to Latin Americans. But this actually makes a lot of sense. And the second question, what are your current plans in order to gather more data on Latinos in the sample for the next surveys?
Should I speak to that, Dana?
Please, go ahead.
So there are two avenues for doing this. One is the a little bit more money route, and the other is the a lot more money route. Okay, so the a lot more money route is we've had some conversations with NORC, so National Opinion Research Center here in Chicago. They have some techniques that can combine a probability sample where we should expect to have appropriate distributions on that front with some convenience sampling, and they use some sort of high-tech weighting schemes to get to a sample that we might feel quite a bit more confident describing as representative of the Cook County population. The just a bit more money avenue involves working with the same survey firm that we did, but sort of we did like a debrief following this, and this was a really important question for us. Cook County is a diverse area, and that's something that we really wanted to be able to, that we wanted to be able to explore the implications of that diversity and even subgroups within those subgroups. And our data that we gathered this past year doesn't allow for that. So we asked them, like, okay, what do we do about this? Like, this is a really big problem because we have substantial underrepresentation in this group. And so the solution that they offered was that they can supplement their efforts to get a descriptively representative sample right? Which in this case sort of failed. Like they ran out of people. We left the survey open for like a couple of extra weeks specifically to try to top off some of these groups, and we were having like one respondent per day or something. So they ran out. They can work with other groups that really specialize in targeted surveying of particular subpopulations, whether they be Black residents, whether they be immigrants, people who identify as Hispanic or whatever. And so pending some funding requests, that second option is what we'll be doing this year, working still with this sort of convenient sample, but spending a little bit of additional money to get more respondents from some of these groups that have been, in some cases fairly badly underrepresented in our sample.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that and note that it's really the Hispanic Latinx population that was underrepresented, again, by about 10 percentage points. So the difference between like 14% in our sample versus 26% in the Cook County population based on census estimates. Whereas in some of the other groups, it's maybe just 2 to 3 percentage points. But then that does relate to Christine's question. If you have in our sample, the Asian population being about 5%, and in Cook County, just under 8% based on census estimates, and that still led to such a small sample size in terms of being able to make statistical distinctions across groups, that maybe this isn't the best place to focus on certain subgroups and intersections, right, with respect to, where somebody was born, for example, and ethnoracial self-identification, that maybe some of those require not just being representative of the population of Cook County, but an over-representation, right? An oversample of some of those groups. So I don't think we're quite there yet, but I wonder if in the future we might want to consider some of that oversampling in order to make some of these distinctions. Because I think Christine's point is also exactly right, that indeed that was an area of interest, is with respect to the Asian population, not just in Cook County, but Asian immigrants in particular. Because again, that population, what we have in our survey, 58% of them were born in the US. So actually a much more sizable immigrant population.
Thank you again, and again, congratulations.
And David, go ahead.
Thanks, Teresa. I think I know the answer to it, but I'd just like to hear you kind of reflect to it about, Christine was talking about, income and employment and whatnot, education. I actually noted that you had some way to differentiate geographic location, county, city. And again, I assume that with a smaller sample size, it's not like you can say, it's certainly not a census tract or whatever. But did you give any thought to, or is it you thought about it but couldn't, to even within the city breaking it up to a sort of broad brushstroke of north, west, south sides, sorry, to the east side of Chicago, which by the way does exist. But any just because, and I thought of it actually first with I think it was Sarah on the, I can't remember who, on the environmental, because I know there are certain groups in certain neighborhoods that are really active and have really engaged their local residents around, coal plants and whatnot. So just kind of curious, the geographic geolocation issue.
David, go ahead.
Do you want me to speak to this one again? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So yes, this is something that we didn't talk about today. It is still in process to some extent, but we did ask people for their zip code, which allows for some interesting potentials to merge with administrative data. So for example, we can use census data to get an estimate of like the poverty rate in the zip code where the respondent is from, the demographic composition of the zip codes where the respondent is from. This in many ways is, as you note, this has relevance certainly for Juanita's work on environmental issues, but also for what Sarah's pursuing with the gentrification issues, and certainly with the policing questions. One of the, Dana and I had a really fun time when we were thinking through how to do all this, because the problem's actually, maybe I should not go down that rabbit hole. There are a lot of interesting questions that arise when you start trying to use zip codes to merge to other data sources. So for example, just as like a small example, the census doesn't actually use zip codes. They have like zip ZCT5s or something that are like kind of like zip, like, and so like there's this merging issue. And then the other thing that we've been kind of struggling with conceptually is that zip code and neighborhood aren't the same thing. You know, neighborhoods, like when people think about like, how are things going in my neighborhood? Am I afraid to walk around here? You know, or are property values going up? Can I breathe? Can people around here breathe the air safely and all this sort of stuff? Zip codes are arguably not the best way to capture that. They're a way. They have the advantage of being pretty small size, right? Like we're not talking about a census tract. We're not talking about even something as sort of broad as like the north side, the south side, the west side, and then the suburbs or something, right? We can get to something more fine grained. One of the things that we are hoping to do in this next iteration, we have a political science grad student who's been developing some GIS skills. And so we're actually considering trying to geolocate people even a little bit more precisely. For example, some researchers at Northwestern fielded a survey that has some similarities. The sampling strategy was a bit different and whatnot. But they asked people what the nearest cross street was in their neighborhood, the nearest like major cross street. And then they use that to sort of geolocate them, and you could pin them into a zip code, but you could also sort of maybe go into a little bit more depth about like what they see as the center of their neighborhood or like a salient spot in their neighborhood. So these are things that we're kind of working on. I'm going on a little bit too long, but I'll note that one of the things Sarah and I have been working on is addressing a simple, seemingly simple question maybe, but one that, as far as we've been able to tell, hasn't been studied much in the literature, which is how well do people's subjective assessments of how things are going in their area track what administrative records say. So for example, we have a question that asks people in your neighborhood, like what would you say, like most of the people who live in your neighborhood are similar to you in terms of their racial and ethnic identification, right? We can figure out what share of people in the respondents' zip code share their racial and ethnic identification. We can sort of get a sense of what the relationship between these sort of our best guess, our best attempt at sort of an objective measure and people's subjective assessments are. So anyways, I'm kind of going all over the place here, but this geolocating piece is something that we're still kind of thinking through how to best leverage.
Thanks.
I'll just add one more thing. We did also ask when people populated their zip code, the second thing we asked them was their neighborhood or municipality based on that zip code, because as you know, those don't necessarily overlap completely. So then they would choose from a menu of, I mean, for some places, it's just one place pops up. For other places, the zip code indicates about 4 different neighborhoods. So they would choose one, or if it was other, they'd tell us what the other is. Now, the neighborhood is not the same thing as the 77 community areas, which almost aggregate up exactly, right? Neighborhoods almost aggregate up, but not quite to the community areas. So I did spend a bit of time this summer doing that. So because it turns out for the crime data that Keyla was interested in looking at, we have it for the city of Chicago based on community areas, which are not zip codes and are not neighborhoods. So we thought we were being very exhaustive in the area level data that we were gathering, and it turns out no. But you know, these are really important, I think, learning lessons for thinking about social science research and thinking about, okay, when I want my unit of analysis is at this level, what does that mean? And can I actually gather data on that? So it's been a fun project. I want to say Elise asked an interesting question in the chat about, did we ask whether someone was a Chicago native? No, we didn't. It's so interesting. Do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, as a Chicago native, I know that I probably feel differently about issues than somebody who is not, right? Maybe I'm more loyal, maybe I'm more forgiving, maybe I'm less forgiving. And so I was just wondering if that was captured. And I just
No,
think
that's a great question. I want to ask that, and I want to know whether people are Cubs fans or White Sox fans, because go Sox, obviously.
right,
We,
yes.
we did the one thing that can somewhat maybe speak to that, not directly. We asked people how long they've lived in their neighborhood.
Yeah.
But it doesn't go as far as I've lived here all my life. It's like 1 or 2 years, you know, it's like windows like that without a sort of, are you from around here?
Right.
Yeah,
right.
I think that's a
Well, I was
really interesting differentiator. Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, I was also thinking about, like, you know, Chicagoans are known for saying, you know, like, what neighborhood are you from is also a proxy for, like, what's your ethnic background, or what's your parish, or what's your, you know, all of those different kinds of things. And then I was wondering if there was a way, and I came in late because I was coming from class, so you may have gone over this, but if there, and this might be coding on the back end later on, but neighborhoods that are gentrifying or have gentrified or are undergoing gentrification, you know, those kinds of indicators.
Can I ask a question, Elise? So if you were looking for evidence of gentrification, so we can kind of do that. And there are a couple of different ways, depending on how we think about what gentrification is, that we could do that. So, for example, Zillow, believe it or not, has this like incredible like historical property value data that's at the zip code level. So you can see, like, they use something like from the, like, between the first and third quartile, the median. They have like some way of sort of describing what we might think of as like the typical home value is. So you got changes in that over time. One could also imagine gentrification having to do with something like other demographic changes, right? Is the neighborhood diversifying? Is it like getting whiter? You know, that type of thing. Do you have thoughts on like how we might think about that? Like what?
Yeah, those are all interesting ideas. I think, you know, also occupation, education, number of coffee shops, you know, or coffee shops over time or something.
Do you know where we could find data on?
I did, you know, actually, I saw something about this. Oh my gosh, it was like in the year and a half of COVID, I saw this somewhere, but I will find it and definitely send that your way. But I just thought that was such an interesting and creative kind of marker.
It's so funny because we actually, when we were designing the survey, we were trying to think of that, and we were like, would you say the number of coffee shops in the neighborhood has gone up or down over the past few years? We didn't end up including it, but like it's good to see that we were sort of thinking.
Well, and you can get that data. I mean, as you know, I don't have to tell you this. You can get that data separately, you know, and then overlay it, you know, upon.
Cool.
Interesting. And then, you know, another thing I might look at are, you know, community meeting minutes, you know, or caps or whatnot, and see if, you know, are people meeting and talking about gentrification? Are they talking about, you know, the problem with Zillow and property values is that property values are so inflated right now. And so that, and then taxes just keep going up and aren't necessarily, and maybe local school board, or, you know, LSC involvement, that kind of thing.
Cool.
But I'm happy to noodle it and then send some ideas.
That would be great.
I have to go to stats. I'm sorry. Bye.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Stewart. I'm with the Parkinson School of Health Science and Public Health. I wanted to, Dr. Brad Hunt is new to Loyola. I think he would be a great resource. Both of us did some stuff on gentrification and with like the tearing down of the public housing, which alluded to, you know, gentrification in like the Cabrini Green area and over in Bronzeville where White Sox Park is and all of that. So I think he would be a great resource in regards to what you all were just talking about. But I also wanted to find out just from my side with the public health and health sciences, if there is an interest in looking at, you know, like the health determinants that kind of goes into all of this as well, and whether you all were interested in collaborating with Parkinson's, like the public health faculty at the health science campus. We did a lot with around COVID. Circle, CERCL, Abigail Silva and Amy Luke did a lot of community development engagement in regards to like the COVID-19 vaccine and rolling that out. And a lot of students were involved in it, and there's a lot of research and data. So just wanted to kind of throw that out there. If you wanted to add like another department, you know, from the health science kind of public health perspective.
Thank you. That's a great idea. And thank you for listing. Well, first of all, Brad Hunt, that's a really, I'd sort of forgotten that was his area of research. Yes. So yes, thank you. And then if you wouldn't mind, could I follow up offline with you as well and think through with respect to Parkinson? I think that's a wonderful idea, and certainly something we were interested in, particularly as we're looking at sort of the consequences of the global pandemic and the next wave, and thinking about some of the mental health consequences as well.
Right. And we have undergraduate and graduate level public health students.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to send you an email as soon as we're done. Thank you. Other questions? I love these questions. Thank you all for listening and engaging with the work. It is really fun to see it all come to fruition, what we've been working so hard on since, well, I think almost 2 years now since Dave and I first started coming up with this idea and thinking about how we wanted to execute the idea. So the students do independent studies with us in the fall and in the spring, either or both. And, so they get course credit with it at some point, but at some point, particularly for our graduate students, there's a certain number of independent studies that can be used. And then, so they're just continuing on because they are interested in the work and they want to continue to develop the work. And so we appreciate their engagement as well. This has been a wonderful group of people to work with.
Thank you all. First of all, this was fascinating. I've been aware of the work in various ways, so to be able to have a presentation from the whole group or most of the group has been very helpful and fascinating. Just a question, and hardly surprised given that I've worked for the last 25 plus years at Curl. Can you say a bit more, and David touched on this a bit in the closing slides, about the connection to community groups? Either in terms of connecting with them, in terms of sharing the data, sort of a translational research sort of focus, or further future discussions or dreams of more participatory action kind of element?
I think we should.
I throw it out to everybody. So
I'd love the students to be, because the ways in which they're conceptualizing and thinking about the outreach vary kind of depending on their project. So I think I'd like to let each of them discuss that.
So I think in particular for me, I act as kind of a community organizer in the suburb where I'm from. So a lot of my work is shared with nonprofits or local community groups, or it's shared with the Board of Education. And like I'm in Berwyn, so it's North and South Berwyn. I share it with both school boards, aldermen there to kind of, lobby for different legislation that is similar to Chicago. And then with our local Congress people, so we have Marie Newman and Chuy Garcia who represent us predominantly. So kind of push them to lobby for police reform. But with a strong focus on that sense of community. So it's always brought from the community. And that's kind of really where my results or that's my vision. That's where I saw my results going to kind of give organizations and community groups the justification, because a lot of time they're participating in claims making, but they don't necessarily have empirical data that can kind of give them that extra push. So that's where I envisioned my results going and what they were meant to do. Thanks.
I can go next.
Oh, you go.
Oh, sorry. So in terms of the environment blog, parallel to this project, Dr. Maria Ekshern and I have also been approaching some of the themes on environmental activism, but through a qualitative methodology. And so we have been interviewing community activists. And what we have found is that there is also this relationship between environmental justice activists needing scholars to provide expert knowledge, for instance, and how there's a two-way communication in what they need, what type of data they need, and what scholars are able to produce. And so we are looking forward in the future to be able to merge that in a more smooth way, meaning we would like to ask questions that these community activists are interested in finding out and then being able to produce those results for them, as well as just finding more how we can work together to tackle environmental racism and environmental justice in a more cohesive way.
Yeah, and then for me, I think a lot of my stuff on policing, it's very similar to what Keyla was talking about, but the idea is kind of giving a voice to the community. These issues are issues that arise in community, are talked about in communities, and again, this is a way to kind of bridge that gap between the feelings of the people of a community and then to more of the lawmakers or the decision makers. So again, bring this information to those decision makers as kind of a way to represent the voices of the community. That is part of where I see the role of this being.
Sarah, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, with the gentrification section, we were like pretty interested in how people really perceive gentrification as a process, because we often talk about it as like a very negative thing that can push people out, but we were very interested in how other people may perceive it as a more positive thing, because it can increase your property value or make your neighborhood better in your subjective opinion. And so we were just very much interested in that, and then letting communities, once we kind of have that section of the analysis done, letting communities know how gentrification is perceived, and letting them do what they want with that information, just because it is such a community by community issue that's very personal to each neighborhood.
Great. Well, we are about at time. Thank you, everyone, so much. This was very informative. We are very happy to have you. Thank you again. And have a great afternoon, and feel free to check back in next week. We're having one of our our previous graduate fellows is going to be presenting from Idaho about some youth work that she's doing. So thank you again, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you for the opportunity. We really appreciate it. Great
Thank
job,
you.
students.
Thank you.
Well done, everybody. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.